What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then what's up? My name's Erica. Heya, how you doing? For today's video, I am chatting with one of my good friends, actually, not only in the classical sphere, but also in the real world. The one, the only, Ms. Anna Gonzalez. Now, Anna is the woman behind one of my, and I say this totally non-biased, one of my favorite classically inspired brands, and that is Aster and Selene. Aster and Selene primarily produces prints at the moment, which hang in homes, which are modern interpretations of ancient artifacts, ancient statues, and ancient art. Now, Anna will be moving with Aster Selene into more homeware this year, which I'm so excited about. And even though obviously we're going to be discussing, Anna's art, what she does, which I know you're uncomfortable being called an artist, we'll get to that, but we will be discussing all of that and the creative decisions that she's made with the pieces that she does. However, what I actually want to focus on today, and I think will be something fun and different for this channel, is more so talking about branding the classical world for a modern audience. And how do you take something that is usually seen in one particular light, that is usually seen in an academic light, and how do you take that and figure out a branding and sort of marketing material? How do you figure out a standpoint and a hill to die on, essentially? How do you figure that out? And then how do you sell that to an audience? And I think it would be so interesting to have this chat with you, Anna, because obviously you have this background in branding and marketing with your day job, and then adapting it for a brand like Aster and Selene, which is doing so well. I think that would probably be the best way to sort of gear this conversation. So a little bit different, I know. But with all that being said, why don't we just hand it over to you, Anna? And why don't we start off this conversation by the way that I normally do it, which is to ask you to explain to everybody watching, how did you come to classics and study the ancient world? Because you do have a degree in this subject. So, we are in safe hands here. Anybody who goes on to Aster and Selene, you are in totally safe hands of somebody who has read Latin and ancient Greek and understands the material and all of this. How did you discover that and start on this journey?
So it was Latin, actually. I think I started Latin when I was about 10 or 11. My dad, who was Colombian, was raised by Jesuits. And when he was at school in Colombia, they had to, they could only speak and listen to Latin before breakfast. So they'd get up really early in the morning. So he grew up with that classical ancient Greek Latin. And I actually really didn't like Latin when I started it. I remember coming home from school and being like, this is silly, it doesn't make any sense, it's too hard. I just got to learning the first declension or something. And he sat me down and he was like, you are not going to be failing this class. It's very logical, we can do this. And so he sat me down and I memorized all my endings. And I think it was one of those things of when you start to get it and it becomes this problem solving thing, I just started to really like it. And I think with ancient languages, you see how much similarity there is in modern languages, and it's really rewarding. And so I carried it on through school. And when it got to doing my A-levels and thinking about university, I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Am I going to do modern languages? Do I want to do literature? And science was a complete and utter no. We knew I wasn't going to go there. So then my Latin teacher said, well, have you thought about classics? And I said, what on earth is that? And he said, well, you love literature and you love history. This way you'll get to do languages and philosophy and you'll get to do all of those things in one. So that's kind of where it started. I think for me, it was really through languages where it started.
So then if your dad pushed you to get into Latin, was then he super excited when you did classics? Because he was like, it worked.
Yeah, my dad was a doctor, so for him, Latin and Greek was through the lens of medicine a lot, and it was very that kind of, how people say in classics. I don't, some of your viewers might be uni students. There's often quite a big divide in the course of that kind of left side, right side of the brain of people who are really good at maths and languages, people who are more artistic and good at languages. For him, he was much more kind of in that medical brain. So I think it was something that was really nice and we really have always had a bond over, because he was obviously thrilled when I did it, because he was like, oh my God, it all started with me. I even remember when I wrote my personal statement, he was like, you should be naming me in the personal statement. And I was like, I don't think that is going to get me into Cambridge.
I love it. So then you went to university for classics, and then fast forward, you start working in marketing, the lockdown happens, and you launch Aster and Selene. So can you walk us through how then, well, you end up going from classics to marketing, which you are very good at, by the way, just in case anybody wants to know. Like, Anna's incredible at her job. So you were clearly very creative, but also working with an analytical brain. And then you went, why don't I combine these two things to make Aster and Selene?
Yeah, I think my brainchild. I think for me, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. I can't tell really whether it was the classic side or whether it was the branding side that kind of came first. But I did always know, for me, it was like I knew I wanted to be in a creative industry. So I sort of sidestepped into a creative industry, into a role that was more kind of like client facing, that you could have any degree to do, really. It was more about whether you could do the role. And through that, really started to understand and interrogate why brands exist, and how they exist, and how powerful they are with consumers. And I think it was the first lockdown when I started to, obviously we had the boom of small businesses, rightly so. People started to shop small, and I started seeing a lot of these small businesses that were taking influence from the classical world. So there were vases of bodies, there were prints of sculptures, and they're kind of taking the essence of architecture or sculpture or art or whatever. But for me, coming from the branding side, I didn't feel like I connected it, or didn't really understand, like didn't get it. And that was just, for me personally, I started thinking about, wow, like the class, I think as a classicist, you think, wow, it's so prevalent, like it's everywhere. You can't not notice classical things once you start to study it. And for me, it was, I was seeing all of these classical motifs and wondering how that would look as a brand, how it would feel as a contemporary brand. I think lots of people think about classics as a dusty old bookshelf, or old dudes sitting and reading Latin and saying their Hail Marys, and actually that's just not what modern and young classicists like. We're all we're like, we love everything from, we love gender and like queer studies to etymology to whatever. And so yeah, I think with Aster and Selene, I started to think about what would a contemporary brand that is home and design based, that would fit in like a modern home, look like. And the thing with branding is that we use this model in the creative world, which is get who to buy. And anyone who's thinking about starting a brand, this is like the easiest thing that you can do to start shaping like your tone of voice and everything. Is you're thinking about who you're getting, who your audience. So in this case, for me, I was like, okay, it's going to be Gen Z, or like young people, maybe 15 to 40-year-olds as my catchment area, who love design and love modern things, who are classy, sophisticated, but also, who take care and pride in the things they curate stuff, right? To engage with the ancient world by interactive content, or by learning, or whatever that buy bit was kind of like Aster and Selene, basically. So I started to kind of piece together, think about words that I would associate with a brand that I would want to interact with. And people, when I discovered your page, Erica, and other people in our community, I started to think, well, not every classicist is sitting like, they're not hoarders, like with all of their books and everything around them. But some of us, we're very multidimensional. Everyone's multidimensional. People might love design. People might want something that like puts a really modern twist on it and actually feels really authentic. Because something that I was quite keen on with Aster and Selene was there are a couple of prints that are a bit more abstract, for sure. But like the amphora prints, which was really where I started to kind of really dig into the brand a bit more, that was for me about, it was kind of about bringing something a bit more accurate and precise into like a modern sphere. So That was kind of one of the principles as well, is like, how do I get people who actually really love classics, who understand these artifacts, who've seen them, who might have traveled across to Greece to see them, something from a piece of the ancient world that they can keep in their home that feels stylish. So that was kind of the premise.
But with Aster and Selene, so this is how you started. This was all of like the mindset of getting into the branding. Now you've had the brand for so many years. So what have you learned along the way of maybe things looking back that you're like, or maybe I could have thought more about that just as well on your, your own branding journey with your full-time job? And what are some things that you've learned along the way that you thought, I could have put that back into Aster and Selene then, and that might have changed things?
So I think to start with, the main thing that is always a struggle for like when you have a small business, especially if it's like a side hustle, is remembering that thing that inspired you to start with. You can easily get imposter syndrome. Everybody gets it. You start posting about something, or you start slipping behind with your posting schedule or your research or whatever, and it becomes this cloud over you of, oh my God, I'm not doing the thing. I think for me, some of those moments where I've had so much other work or life stuff to deal with, and perhaps I haven't had the time that I'd like to put in the brand, rather than getting so stuck in my head and being like, it's been like 2 months now, so I'm just going to not post at all, is to just crack on with it and like remember the things that really inspire you, the people who interact with you, and just kind of keep exploring and keep sort of trying new things. A brand, even if you've got a tone of voice, or even if you've got a design or a new website like I have recently, it doesn't mean you kind of stop there and you're finished. So I think something that I've told myself this year, already in April, to try and do is just to kind of keep chipping away and like exploring new spaces, because those first 2 years of a brand, you're putting everything out there to see what sticks. And that's sometimes why it does well or grows really quickly, because you're just putting stuff out there and it's very authentic. It's not like, it doesn't have to be totally perfect. So
I think that's such an important point, because that's something that I do with YouTube still, even though like I kind of know what works with YouTube. The idea of like just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks at it, and things that don't work, that's fine. Like, I think a lot of people, maybe they need to hear this from both of us, that's like, you just kind of need to get over the fear of like, you're going to fail, because some things just won't work. And that's okay, because then maybe it's the color scheme of something in your case, or like the style or something that is going to work. It's just not on that specific thing. And that's completely okay.
Yeah. And I think it's like not being afraid to pivot when you feel a bit stuck. I kind of went through, people will see this on my feed. There was a large chunk of time where I found a style, like styling my prints and stuff, that really worked. And I did tons of photo shoots and I got loads of content from it. And then that kind of dries up and you think, okay, what's next? And actually not saying, okay, I found a formula that works, I'm just going to stick to that. And being able to step outside it and say, time for a new chapter in the brand, or time to step up, time to explore this thing or this trend. And just, again, going through that process of chucking stuff out there. It feels chaotic to us, but I don't think anyone else feels that way, which is really odd.
No, I completely agree. I think that like, especially like with me in videos, I'll be like, we're just going to do this rogue thing. Let's see if anybody likes it. And if it works, I'll keep doing it. And if not, it doesn't. But like, again, just throwing it out there, it seems so left field compared to, as well, like you're saying, the other things that you're doing. But it's kind of like, it might go really well. So the risk is worth it. And just literally throwing it out there, trying something completely different, exploring new trends, combining things. Like, how have you actually found that? Because you're in more so an artistic space than I am. So trends are very different. Like for me, it's more so like content that people are engaging with podcast wise and YouTube wise. Like, what am I going to do and what do students need? But yours is color based, trend based, in a way, fashion based.
Yeah, it's quite visual. I mean, this is going to sound really odd, but I actually cringe when people call me an artist, because it's not my job. And I feel like it's that imposter syndrome of like, I'm not a designer, like don't ask me to do anything. But for me, it's obviously a passion that especially when work's busy, right? I don't always have the time to churn out new prints. Like, I've actually got loads of prints. I've got maybe half a dozen prints that are like half finished at the moment. And for me, with trends, like I try and think about what material I can refashion. If I've got a collection of 20 prints, which I think is probably about what I have at the moment, I just think about like what I can reskin. And I think a lot of pressure comes from, especially with content creation that is really design based. It's just about like looking at things in a different light. It's not about like always having to have a new piece of art. And that's the thing for me. I was like, I'm not an artist full-time, certainly not an artist full-time. And I'm also not, my style of art is not super abstract. Like I'm not thinking things up. Like, you know, there's some amazing artists that I really, really admire, like Flora's one of them, who can design stuff from nothing, because that's their strength, that's their talent, their training. For me, like I'm coming in at art at quite a specific angle of finding things that exist, that I have really good photos from, really, really strong references for, and that I can basically translate into something more modern. So yeah, when it comes to trends and stuff, I try and you work with what I've got. I try and reskin some old stuff. I try and take the elements of what people are using, whether that's like an audio or whether that's like an aesthetic, and I try and use kind of what I've got and kind of push the brand into that space, rather than having to reinvent the wheel, because that's just quite hard.
So what just occurred to me though is that there might be people watching this that might not know where the name Aster and Selene came from. Do you want to explain how you got that name?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite it's quite a long answer, so buckle up. I mean, I felt like, coming back to when I started the business and like I was doing a bit of a scan of the landscape and what sorts of small businesses were out there, I felt like in the home and design area, everything was really feminine. And I'm queer, and I'm also like have a lot of friends, queer friends, and people in the classical world who wouldn't necessarily like buy from brands like that. And I feel like the main thing with Aster and Selene is about accessibility, right? So when I was thinking about the name, I was like, I want to achieve something that feels balanced, that feels kind of like gender neutral in a way, that doesn't evoke one thing or another. And that trickles down to obviously then the look and feel. But from the name point of view, I was like, I want to pick concepts that are important to all ancient civilizations, whether you're Aztec or whether you're Greek or Persian or Roman or Egyptian. Like I wanted a concept or a name that could speak to and be explored within different civilizations. Greek history is my favorite, so I kind of settled on, I knew that astrology and cosmology and stuff would be an interesting area. And Aster and Selene obviously are Greek words, so I kind of felt like in my head I was like David and Goliath, a bit more than like Pharaoh and Bull, if you know what I mean. But that was kind of the logic behind it. Well, I wanted to have something that just felt a little bit more neutral and that felt quite calm, and that, yeah, as I say, the main thing for me was something that was important and that could kind of open doors for me in the future. If Aster and Selene grows into something that's more like a marketplace or a forum or somewhere where I collaborate with other artists and other creators, I didn't want to pigeonhole myself into something that felt really small, that was born in Lincolnshire and Middle England, you know?
Well, I think it's interesting about names because I think that's where people struggle the most. Like people that I have met, at least, like I know lots of other classics people who haven't yet like launched their platform because they don't have a name for it. And there's so much pressure on like, well, what do I name it? And like, how do I go about it? So did you go through a bunch of different names before settling on Aster and Selene, or were you pretty happy when you came up with that?
Oh God, I'm not sure if I can remember. I think the way that I went about it was really interrogating who my audience were, or who I wanted them to be, because I didn't actually really know who they were. I wrote down a bunch of words that I wanted people to feel and think and do as a result of the brand, and what I wanted people to associate with. I think, Yeah, I mean, with the name, like it kind of just stuck in my head. I definitely had a few different things flying around, but I kept coming back to it. And I think when I opened myself up to there being two parts, I was like, oh, I kind of like this. It's a bit different. I think sometimes when you've got like a one word in a brand, like, and you're trying to do a million things, it can be really stressful because you're like, oh my God, does it like represent everything that I'm ever going to do from here now till, the end of time? But yeah, I think for me, the naming thing was like, what do I want people to think about? Like, what does the brand represent? Like, how do I want to be able to future proof it and be able to push it forward in the future if I want to grow it? Like, what's the really massive aspiration for it? And I think thinking about kind of like that territory and sort of finding potentially where the boundaries were for the brand helped me. It certainly helped me rule stuff out. Like, it certainly made me think, okay, it's not going to be this is too feminine, or this is too like specific to design or homeware, or to one culture or another. So
I had the same thing when thinking of Moan, that like I knew when I would hit something that wasn't it, I was like, well, okay, well, we're just gonna rule that out. And I would try like, like nymph names or like any random Greek word I could think of. I was like, oh, is this gonna work? And it's just like, well, it's definitely not down that route. Like, you'll just kind of know because it sounds wrong.
I think you've got to think about branding. Like, it's so easy when it's your own brainchild to think about what you love and what you want it to be. And actually, if you think about what's the audience that I want to tap into, what do they love? What will they be interested in? Like, what are the doors that I'm going to open for them with this brand? That's where it needs to come from.
I completely agree. And it's funny that like you're just talking this way, because it's like I've never spoken to somebody who's been so on the same wavelength. Because with Moan, so I knew I wanted it to be like, people who don't know, because I've never explained this on the channel, but it stands for Modern Ancients. And I knew it was going to be that, right? Because I was like, well, we're just going to do the ancient world, but just me sitting in like my hoodies or whatever it is and swearing a bunch. And that's it. That's entirely what it is. And it was actually my dad who was like, you've got to change the name because this is not going to work, which, lol, joke, he now takes that back. But at the time he was like, you have to change this name. This is not going to work because it's not specific enough to what ancient you're pushing forward.
Yeah.
And for me, I was very much like, but I don't know, because what if I start reading things and then, like, for all I know, next year I'm really into Egyptian history. I have no idea where that's going to take me. And so to pigeonhole myself into, well, we're just going to talk about Greece and Rome, at the moment that's what it is, but it might not always be that. So that's why I kept it as just Modern Ancients. Like, we'll see.
I think totally. And I even started to think at the time, what if I wanted to explore stuff in classical reception or the Renaissance, where right now I don't know tons about it, like other than, a few bits of Michelangelo here and there and stuff like that. But like, if you want to start drawing on, even Shakespeare or like, literature around that time, or I don't know, or if I wanted to collaborate with somebody that did, like, for me, I was like, okay, the main thing here is classics, and like that is the reason why it exists. The fact that it's design or the fact that it's an art print is completely irrelevant. So that was another thing. When I started thinking about products for Aster and Selene, I initially was like, oh, I wanted to hop on the candle bandwagon. Oh, I was like, that's going to be quite labor intensive for me with my normal job. And, like, I can't always, if I'm down here in London, like, I didn't know if I'd have enough kitchen space or storage space, stuff like that. So I was like, I need something that like is a product that's relatively easy to produce, relatively cheap to produce, and it's not too labor intensive. But that said, if in the future I decided I wanted to make another product, and I do have another product coming up, teaser trailer, then it would need to, then I'd need to have a name and like have a brand that kind of allowed me to do that, to grow into it. So if I had, if I called myself Anna Gonzalez Art, which I never ever would ever have done, but if I had, then I'm kind of limiting myself. Do you know what I mean? And like a big thing for me was, I don't want to be the brand. Like, sometimes when you're a small business, you kind of end up being the brand, sort of, and that's fine. because, you know, you got to be comfortable in front of a camera and interacting with your own products. But ultimately, like the brand, I wanted it to speak for itself. I wanted people to connect with it. I'm not asking people to just connect with me. If they do, then great. And I love some of the conversations I get to have with people, but I want people to sit at home, have a piece of art in their home, other people to come over and say, hey, what's that about? Like, where did you get that? And for them to feel like they have their own connection, rather than just saying, oh, it's this person called Anna. I want them to say, oh, it's this Minoan octopus vase from, like, you know, 1000 BC, and it, yeah, has this story behind it. So,
or even like, you know, not even that. Like, let's say that people are in a home and like one of your pieces, if we take the Minoan octopus, and people are just like, honestly, I don't really know what it is, but isn't it nice? And then someone else might say, oh, you don't know what that is? I know what that is. And then it starts that kind of a conversation.
Exactly. And I think also, like, there is something, and one of the things I just love about classics and art in particular is there is something really innately fascinating about some of those core pieces of art. Some of the things that were the first, like the heads, for example, the colossal heads of Alexander, you know, they're fully in the mainstream now as a piece of like iconography. You know, that is not, it's something that most people would recognize, and they'd probably be able to say, oh, it's ancient, right? And so for me, I was like, there's something so beautiful and pure about the fact that a lot of ancient, particularly lots of like ancient Greek sculpture kind of set the ball rolling, and like, so almost like started the archetype for a lot of those things. So, you know, and you know, lots of my mom's friends, for example, they've bought prints from me because they love looking at them, and they just think that they're interesting. Like they love either hearing me talk about it, or researching about it, or even just looking at it and saying, hey, look, I know that this is what's going on here, or look at how nice this pattern looks, even if they're, you know, not gonna start quoting Homer from it or something, you know.
Well, I think that also goes back to what you were saying, that like, let's say you want to collaborate with somebody who's more into Renaissance art or something like that. Like as you're saying, classics kind of got that ball rolling. So it does come out, and there are so many pieces, if you go to like any museum from different time periods, that will be about a myth, or that will have a character from myth in this piece, or will be a reimagining of, you know, this history or whatever it is. Like, it happens all the time. So it's all that, like, I guess, like, conversation happening through history that is kind of continuing with your brand, which, now that I've put that together, is like really so pure and so adorable.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it, with classics? I mean, anybody who is interested in classics or has studied classics, you know, whether they are on that scale, they'll start to notice that there's always stuff coming through that still lives on from that period of history. And for me, as a brand, I want people to have, you know, whatever style of home they have, whether it's modern or whether it's like more traditional, whatever. But like, you know, my home's quite modern. So for me, I was like, I want to be able to have like a collage on the wall, or to have two big statement prints that for me are super nerdy, but to anyone coming in, that doesn't feel too out of place. Like, it still looks like it belongs in that kind of contemporary home. So yeah, I think that's an important part of, like, if you're a classicist, or just, you know, for me, that was definitely an important thing.
I agree. And I think as well, looking at it from like a modern standpoint in modern homes, it's sort of like, you kind of, at the moment, which is not a bad thing, there are lots of people in the small business space that are like, we're just going to use loads of color and just like, you know, make this a really loud print, but a really old print, or make it very cartoony, or we're going to have these like huge things that are whatever, which is fine. Those all work in of themselves. But it's kind of nice to have a brand like yours as well that offers a lot of variety as well, that I think maybe people who don't know your brand like won't know, that it's like, you do have that like bright blue or the bright green pots, that it's like, here's the statement piece. And then you have some other ones which are like basically just like on a canvas, which is so beautiful and so subtle and just there.
Yeah, I definitely, and that's like, truthfully, partly because I'm still experimenting with my style and still understanding what I love to draw and what, you know, maybe I think people want to have. I think, you know, like the Venus piece, for example, lots of my friends said to me, please, can you draw this for me? That's why I drew it, because they were like, I want to have like a single line figure of a woman. Like if you could do the Venus de Milo, that would be even better, because then it's classical. So that was one of the reasons why I drew that piece. And then I did the torso piece to match it, just to kind of experiment with that style. I think there are, like the amphora pieces, like the octopus, the olive pickers. I would say that's more where my heart draws to, because I'm like, it's so intricate and it's so fascinating, and like takes me freaking ages to draw. I mean, the Amazons piece, I felt sick after it, because I was like, when is this gonna end? Like, there needs to be an end point. But I think truthfully that it's down to experimenting with my style as well, and knowing that I didn't want to get too deep into illustration, because I'm not a strong illustrator. I'm not a strong cartoonist. I didn't feel like I could pull that off comfortably. So
I guess as you were talking, what I was thinking was, so if you're so comfortable throwing things at a wall, which I am as well, as we've discussed, do you have any ideas of what other things you're going to be throwing at the wall, sort of once this comes out, people start hearing about, your brand through this video? What are some things that like we can expect? Not like successes necessarily, but just ideas that are knocking around in your head that you're like, oh, I kind of want to try this.
So I have got a couple of things in the works, and like something that now I'm like actually have finalized. I've got all my stock. And basically the next step for me from like a product point of view is definitely to push into that home space. Tableware, for example, or ornaments, or things that feel quite stylish, sort of like pieces of art as well. I think breaking away from just the art prints is definitely something that I have always seen for the brand, and the prints were and are the hero product, but for me they were the kind of safe option to try. I think also more abstractly, I just would love to collaborate more. I'd love to get more in the content space. I'd love to start doing events, maybe some small, sort of really, really small events that get the right people together, that get us all, people who are passionate about the same things, into a room to discover and to kind of share their experiences of classics, or to just start making something, or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, for me, just from the brand's point of view, I definitely like to look at more than just art prints. And as a creator and as a small business, I'd love to start exploring how Aster and Selene lives with other brands and with other creators and new content and all of that kind of thing. Whether that's like a small dining experience or something would be really nice. There's some great creators out there. Cozzy's one of them, who we've been chatting about trying to do something for ages, and just, yeah, finding people with different strengths, I guess, and trying to give the brand a new voice in that way would be nice.
Okay, so you might be uncomfortable answering this, because that's fine. You can literally just be like, Eric, I don't want to. But I'm going to ask you because I'm really curious. So in your ideal imagination world, fantasy world, where is Aster Selene in like 10 years?
I mean, if I'm going to dream really big, Aster and Selene for me is like an Oliver bonus, but for classical people. That's how I would see it. I mean, minus the clothes, more like the home. I think for me, like Aster and Selene is sort of a concept as well. And this is why coming back to the name, it was very important for me to think about something I could grow into. Like, I would love it to be almost like a forum, like a big, not necessarily like a marketplace, but a brand that invites like other people from the space, that sells other products from the space, that is maybe like co-branded stuff. I think for me, I'd love to have a probably not a permanent physical store, but certainly like a physical presence that's really like consistent, and that people can know where to find me, that I can do big shows, or big like kind of country fairs or stuff like that, or like sort of markets, but maybe in London, like kind of small makers markets and stuff like that. I mean, it's difficult because when, like as a small brand, and you might find this, you start off niche-ish and you find your niche audience. And I definitely would never want to lose that. I definitely just would want to grow it. That's all. I think some high street brands, I think people kind of don't really engage with anymore because they don't feel like there's enough nuance or like that they're kind of catered for as an audience. That's like my biggest fear in branding, is that you start to become really generic. Like you can appeal to a lot of people and you can try and cater or get lots of different types of people interested, but ultimately like what your brand is still has to be quite niche. So that's definitely a phobia of mine, that I become like this wishy-washy like thing that like is just trying to be everything to all people. But yeah, I don't know really. Like I think I'll try and be guided by those principles, like why I started it up. And if there's ways that I can magnify that, whether that's through new products or events or content, then that's definitely territory that I'd like to explore.
Well, I think striking that balance is so much harder than I think people realize. Because, like, again, I've dealt with the same thing where it's like I started thinking, oh, we'll just make these general videos for kind of everyone's consumption. And I was like, well, that's not going to work if I just go at it from just these random topics. So who am I targeting? And in the beginning, I was like, students, entirely students. We're going to go for that one. And then sort of over time, it was like, well, what about if I go into books as well? Because I'm into that and it's still niche and on topic, but you can expand out a little bit there. And the way I describe it to people, which again, I've not done on this channel, I probably should have, is kind of like viewing it in sort of a Venn diagram and having your niche and then seeing where your niche intersects with other niches and sort of working from there and figuring out sort of what is the most logical niche to then go into, from there.
Yeah, it's totally about your audience. It's always about your audience. And if your audience taste changes, like we said earlier, or your audience wants something, then that should always be the thing that guides you. If people suddenly, if there was like I don't know, I'm not going to say that I'm going to do it, but let's say that everyone only started buying AI art and people said, I want you to start, we all want you to start making some kind of classical AI art. If I really, really like dug my heels in, then without even considering that's something that I could explore as an experiment, then I think that you end up being too close-minded about it, right?
Completely agree. And I think as well, like listening to your audience and knowing that sometimes as well, they're going to be wrong and that's okay. But that's another form of collaboration, that like when I do videos and I see people commenting saying, can you do this? Can you do this? I know that video isn't going to perform. I know you want to see that, but it's not going to perform. Sometimes I'm wrong and I upload a video and I'm like, whoa, okay, turns out they did really want to see this. Never mind. And sometimes they're wrong, but that's okay. That's collaboration and that's listening to your audience and thinking, okay, in this instance, I knew better. Sometimes they do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like you're always leading and taking, like people follow you because you are giving them something and you're leading them. And at some point, there sometimes comes a point where people say, oh, can you do a print of this? Or can you do that? And I mean, like for me, when I finally did the Persian print that I made, which is one of my favorites, actually, it hasn't sold as well as I thought it would. And that's perhaps because it's not the one that like appeals to a lot of people or even a lot of classicists. So it's a bit of like working out what you really want to do and what you want to really achieve and like what other people might be interested in. And that's where I think as you start to grow, you just have to not overthink it. Like if something doesn't do as well as you thought it would, it doesn't mean you're failing as a brand. You never would have thought that when you started. You'd just be going with the flow and seeing what sticks, which seems to be like maybe the title of this video now. But that's the mindset you'd have. But yeah.
So the way I like to end all of these is the same question for everybody. So regardless of authors, professors, whatever, get the exact same question. So I'm going to pose it to you as well. If someone is starting off in the small business space, what is the advice that you can give to them that they might need to push forward to either post that first thing, launch that first product? what's the little bit that you can pass on to them?
I think if you believe in it, then it will work, because you wouldn't have had the idea to start with if you didn't think it was compelling. So I think my advice is just to write down all the things that this idea makes you feel, that inspires you, that gets you really, really excited. And soon enough, you'll kind of have a blueprint and the steps that you need to make it happen. I think just start ideating, let your brain run with it, and let yourself kind of dream about it. That's the main advice I'd have.
Unfortunately, guys, that is now time to wrap this interview up. So Anna, obviously a huge thank you to you for joining me today. And as I say at the end of every single one of these videos, thank you guys for watching the whole video through. Thank you guys for liking, subscribing, supporting the channel. It means the world to me. I love bringing my friends on and having these chats. And hopefully they are slightly helpful for you guys. I mean, this one, hopefully, in a more so small business kind of way, as well as an educational way, obviously with the ancient world. Now, because we've done nothing but talk about Aster and Selene, you guys can find all of the links to Anna's incredible brand down in the description below. You guys can find the website, you guys can find the Instagram, everything you should need is down there, all of Anna's socials, so you guys can keep up to date with those homeware drops, and you guys can keep up to date with all the new prints that Anna puts out. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. So I'll see you guys then.